The barking sliced through the library's silence like a sharpened blade through velvet. It wasn't a common warning, but an ancestral lament that seemed to carry the weight of centuries in its sound waves. The sentinel, a German shepherd whose coat was silvered by time, fixed his golden eyes on something only he could perceive in the shadows between the dusty shelves. His human companion, a 38-year-old historian known in the small town only as the Archive Explorer, barely lifted his eyes from the yellowed parchments he had been studying for hours. The autumn afternoon spilled its melancholic light through the tall windows, painting ghostly patterns on the ancient books, as if time itself were trying to tell a forgotten story. The town carried on its cobblestone streets and colonial houses the weight of untold stories. It was a place where the past breathed through cracks in the walls and whispered secrets through the wind that swept across the deserted squares at dusk. The historian had arrived there exactly 6 months ago, bringing only the essentials and his faithful canine companion. No one knew for sure what had brought him to this place forgotten by progress, but the elders murmured that certain souls were called back home, even when they didn't know they had one. The sentinel was no ordinary dog. His years of life had given him a peculiar wisdom, a sensitivity to perceive the invisible currents that flowed through time and space. As a puppy, he had been found wandering near the ruins of an old mansion on the outskirts of town, as if waiting for someone who would take decades to arrive. The local veterinarian, a man who knew the ancient legends, had said that some animals were born with the gift of guarding memories that weren't their own, of protecting stories that needed to be told. On that particular afternoon, as the historian delved deeper into his research on the town's founding families, the sentinel showed increasing unease. His fur bristled subtly whenever his human approached certain documents, as if the paper itself exuded an energy that only he could sense. The municipal archive was a labyrinth of secrets, each drawer holding fragments of lives that had intertwined and unraveled over the centuries. The first subtle turning point came when the historian found a fragmented map, drawn with symbols he couldn't fully decipher. The paper was so fragile it seemed it would crumble at the slightest touch, but the ink strokes were still visible, forming patterns reminiscent of unknown constellations. The sentinel cautiously approached, sniffing the document with an intensity that made the historian pause. It was as if the dog recognized something in those symbols, an ancestral memory etched into his instincts. The archive curator, a lady with hair as white as snow and eyes that seemed to have seen more than one lifetime should allow, watched from afar. Mrs. Elena, as she was known, carried the keys to all the secrets of that place hanging on a bunch that tinkled softly as she walked. There was something in her gaze as she watched the historian work, a mixture of expectation and apprehension, like someone watching the unfolding of a long-awaited prophecy. Days turned into weeks, and the historian felt increasingly connected to those ancient documents. It was as if each page turned brought him closer to something fundamental, a truth that pulsed beneath the surface of the town's official history. The sentinel became his involuntary guide, directing his attention to specific sections of the library through his movements and reactions. When the dog refused to enter a particular corridor, the historian had learned to respect his instincts. The first major discovery came through an 18th-century parish register book. Between baptisms and marriages, there were peculiar notes about a family whose surname echoed something familiar in the historian's mind. The margins of the book contained observations in a different script, almost like whispered writings, mentioning a tragedy that had been deliberately omitted from the official records. The sentinel, noticing the change in his human's breathing, approached and rested his head on his lap, as if offering comfort for a pain not yet understood. That's when the first significant obstacle arose. The town council, through a formal letter, denied the historian access to a specific section of the archives, citing preservation and confidentiality issues. Frustration burned in his chest like embers, but it was accompanied by an even greater determination. Why hide historical documents? What secrets could be so dangerous after centuries? The second turning point, this time of medium impact, happened during a particularly violent storm. The historian had stayed late at the library, ignoring the sentinel's warnings as he barked insistently at the window. When he finally decided to leave, the rain was falling in dense curtains, turning the hot streets into temporary rivers. That's when Mrs. Elena emerged from the shadows, offering shelter in her nearby house. It was the first time she had approached him directly. In the curator's living room, surrounded by old photographs and objects that seemed to carry the weight of generations, the historian discovered that he wasn't the first to seek those secrets. Mrs. Elena revealed, her voice trembling with contained emotion, that she had waited decades for someone with enough courage to unearth the truth. She knew the real story, passed down from generation to generation through whispers and lullabies that hid maps in their melodies. The sentinel, normally protective and distrustful of strangers, showed unusual trust in Mrs. Elena. It was as if he recognized in her an old ally, someone who shared the same purpose. The old woman stroked the dog's head with slightly trembling hands and whispered words in an ancient dialect that the historian didn't understand, but which made the sentinel close his eyes in apparent understanding. That night, as the storm raged outside like a wounded animal, Mrs. Elena shared fragments of the forbidden story. She spoke of a prosperous family that had founded the town, of a forbidden love that defied social conventions, and of a tragedy that had stained the earth with blood and tears. But there was more, something she wasn't yet ready to fully reveal, as if the words needed to be earned through actions, not simply heard. The historian returned to the library with a new perspective. The documents that had previously seemed random now formed a clear pattern. With the subtle help of Mrs. Elena, who occasionally dropped seemingly casual comments about where to look, he began to put the puzzle together. The sentinel became even more vigilant, as if sensing that they were approaching something significant. The third turning point came through a dream. The historian had fallen asleep over the documents, exhausted from weeks of intense research. In his dream, he saw a man who looked frighteningly like himself, dressed in clothes from another era, holding the hand of a woman whose face was obscured by shadows. The sentinel appeared in the dream, but not as he was now, but as a playful puppy running between the couple's legs. When he woke up, the historian found the sentinel staring intently at him, as if he had shared the same vision. That's when the first major tension arose. The historian discovered, hidden between the pages of a ledger, a sealed letter that had never been opened. The red wax seal was still intact after centuries, as if time had decided to preserve that specific secret. His hands trembled as he held the envelope, and the sentinel began to growl low, a guttural sound that reverberated through the empty library. It was as if the dog could feel the weight of what was about to be revealed. The decision to open the letter was not taken lightly. The historian spent days contemplating the implications, feeling an inexplicable resistance that seemed to come from within himself. It was as if generations of silence were fighting against the urge to know the truth. Mrs. Elena, in one of her enigmatic comments, had said that some doors, once opened, could not be closed again. When he finally broke the seal, the sound seemed to echo through time. The letter, written in an elegant but hurried script, revealed the confession of a crime of passion, an act of despair that had destroyed two families and cast a shadow over future generations. The name of the letter's author made the historian's blood run cold. It was his own surname, only slightly distorted by the passage of centuries. The sentinel, sensing his human's anguish, pressed against his legs, offering the warmth of his body as a shield against the cold that seemed to emanate from those ancient words. The library, always a refuge of knowledge and peace, now seemed oppressive, the shadows between the shelves taking on menacing shapes in the historian's disturbed imagination. In the days that followed, the historian fought against the temptation to abandon his research. The truth that was beginning to emerge was more painful than any fiction. He discovered that his own lineage was intertwined with the tragedy that had shaped the town's destiny. The crime mentioned in the letter had been motivated by jealousy and wounded honor, resulting in the death of innocents and the forced exile of the survivors. It was during this period of emotional turmoil that the relationship with Mrs. Elena began to deepen beyond the professional. In a gesture of unexpected kindness, she brought him herbal tea from her personal garden during a particularly difficult afternoon. Their hands touched briefly as he accepted the cup, and something passed between them, a mutual recognition of souls carrying similar burdens. The sentinel observed these interactions with apparent approval, his tail wagging slightly whenever Mrs. Elena approached. It was as if the dog understood that his human needed more than his loyal companionship to face what was to come. The curator, in turn, showed infinite patience with the historian's moments of doubt and despair. The fourth turning point of medium impact arose when the historian discovered a series of old daguerreotypes in a box that Mrs. Elena had accidentally left on his research table. The images showed people in 19th century clothing, but it was one in particular that took his breath away. It was a family portrait where he could clearly see the physical similarities that linked him to those long-dead people. Even more disturbing was the presence of a dog next to the family, identical to the sentinel in every aspect. The implications of this discovery were dizzying. How was it possible? The historian looked at his canine companion, who returned the gaze with ancient serenity, as if guarding secrets that transcended common understanding. Mrs. Elena, when questioned, just smiled enigmatically and said that some lineages were not just of blood, but of purpose. The second moment of high tension arrived when the historian decided to visit the ruins mentioned in the documents. The site, hidden by overgrown vegetation over the centuries, was on the edge of town. The sentinel showed extreme reluctance to approach, his whole body trembling with an intensity that the historian had never witnessed. It was as if the dog could feel echoes of pain and suffering that still permeated that place. As they explored the ruins under a sky that threatened a storm, the historian found physical evidence that corroborated the documents. Fire marks on the stone walls, a rusty dagger half buried in what had once been a garden, and more disturbingly, small personal items that humanized the victims of the tragedy. The sentinel stayed close, his body tense like a violin string about to break. That's when the first physical manifestation of the past occurred. The historian felt a sudden pressure on his chest, as if invisible hands were trying to push him away. The air became thick and cold despite the heat of the day. The sentinel exploded in furious barks directed at nothing, his fur completely bristling, assuming a fighting stance against an enemy that only he could perceive. The escape from the ruins was chaotic. The historian, carrying the sentinel who refused to walk, ran through the vegetation while feeling an oppressive presence in pursuit. It wasn't a physical chase, but something deeper, as if the past itself were trying to prevent its secrets from being revealed. When they finally reached the safety of the town, they were both exhausted and disturbed. Mrs. Elena was waiting for them at the library, as if she knew exactly where they had been. Her expression was a mixture of concern and resignation. She led them to a room in the back that the historian had never noticed before, filled with objects that seemed to pulse with their own energy. There, she finally revealed the complete truth in a moment of mutual vulnerability that marked the third crucial moment of their growing relationship. The curse, for that's what she called it, wasn't supernatural in the traditional sense. It was the accumulated weight of guilt, secrets, and unresolved pain that passed through generations like a hereditary disease of the soul. Each descendant of the families involved in the tragedy carried this burden, manifesting in different ways. For some, it was inexplicable melancholy. For others, like the historian, it was a compulsion to seek answers without knowing the questions. The sentinel, Mrs. Elena explained with tears in her eyes, was more than he seemed. Dogs like him were occasionally born in the vicinity of the ruins, always with the same appearance, always with the same purpose. They were guardians not of the place, but of the souls who needed to find redemption. They guided the descendants back to the truth, protecting them from the full weight of the revelation until they were ready to face it. The fifth turning point, this time subtle but profound, came through a song. Mrs. Elena, in a moment of apparent distraction, began to hum a melody that the historian immediately recognized. It was the same song that his grandmother used to murmur when she thought no one was listening, a sad melody that had always disturbed him as a child. The words, when he finally heard them complete, were a coded map. Instructions left by those who knew that one day someone would need to find their way back. With this new understanding, the historian returned to the documents with a renewed purpose. He was no longer just unearthing the past. He was actively working to heal it. The sentinel, sensing the change in his human, became less anxious, although he maintained his constant vigilance. Together, they began to piece together not only the story of what had happened, but the path to redemption. The sixth turning point of medium impact arose when the historian discovered that he was not the only living descendant of the families involved. Through meticulous genealogical records, he identified others who carried the same burden, scattered across different towns, all living lives marked by inexplicable sadness. The decision to contact them was difficult but necessary. The fourth important moment in his relationship with Mrs. Elena happened when she revealed her own connection to the story. She was not only a guardian of knowledge, but also a descendant, on the side of the victims. Her family had preserved the truth through generations, waiting for the moment when healing could finally happen. The shared vulnerability at that moment brought them closer in a way that transcended romantic attraction. It was a recognition of souls who shared a sacred purpose. As the historian worked to gather all the fragments of the story, the sentinel began to show signs of accelerated aging. It was as if the proximity of the resolution was consuming his life force. The veterinarian couldn't find a medical cause, only murmuring about how some dogs lived to fulfill a purpose and departed when it was complete. The fear of losing his faithful companion added urgency to the historian's efforts. He worked tirelessly, deciphering codes, translating ancient documents, and assembling the complete narrative of what had happened on that fateful night centuries ago. Mrs. Elena remained by his side, offering silent support and knowledge when needed. The seventh turning point came through a shared dream. Both the historian and Mrs. Elena reported having dreamed of the same scene, a meeting between the original protagonists of the tragedy in a place that seemed to exist outside of time. In the dream, they were no longer victims and perpetrators, but souls seeking forgiveness and understanding. The sentinel appeared in the dream as a bridge of light between the two groups, his canine form transforming into something more ethereal and sacred. Upon waking, they both knew that the moment of the final confrontation was approaching. The historian had gathered enough evidence not only to retell the story, but to recontextualize it. What had been painted as a crime of honor was, in fact, a tragedy of misunderstandings, unfounded jealousies, and decisions made in the heat of passion that had destroyed innocent lives. The third moment of high tension arrived when the historian decided to hold a reconciliation ceremony at the ruins. He had contacted the other descendants, and surprisingly, many had responded, drawn by the promise of finally understanding the source of their hereditary melancholy. Mrs. Elena had prepared everything according to ancient traditions that her family had preserved for this moment. The walk to the ruins was solemn. The sentinel, despite his increasing weakness, insisted on leading the way. His silver fur shone in the twilight light as if it were woven from moonlight. The group of descendants followed in silence, each carrying candles and symbolic objects that represented their family lineages. Upon arriving at the ruins, the atmosphere was electrically charged. The air seemed to vibrate with the presence of something ancient and expectant. The historian could feel the weight of generations on his shoulders, but also a growing lightness, as if the simple decision to face the truth had already begun the healing process. The sentinel positioned himself in the center of the ruins, his golden eyes reflecting a wisdom that transcended his animal form. Mrs. Elena began the ceremony with words in an ancient dialect, her voice carrying the authority of generations of guardians. One by one, the descendants shared their stories, the patterns of pain that had marked their families. Tears flowed freely as connections were made and understandings were reached. The historian, when his turn came, read excerpts from the documents he had discovered, giving voice to those who had been silenced for centuries. That's when the eighth turning point of great impact occurred. As the historian read the last confession, the one that revealed the innocence of one of the accused parties, the sentinel began to howl. It wasn't a sound of pain, but of liberation, a song that seemed to echo through dimensions. The ruins began to seem less oppressive, the shadows less menacing. It was as if the place itself breathed a sigh of relief for the first time in centuries. The emotional climax came when the historian, following an impulse that seemed to come from beyond himself, picked up the rusty dagger he had found on his first visit. With ceremonial gestures that Mrs. Elena guided, he buried it deep in the ground, symbolically burying the weapons of the tragedy. At that moment, the sentinel gave one last powerful bark before lying down peacefully on the ground, his eyes closing, with an expression of mission accomplished. The historian's initial panic was calmed by Mrs. Elena, who held his hand firmly. She whispered that the sentinel wasn't dying in the common sense but transforming. And indeed, as the group watched in reverent silence, the dog's body began to emanate a soft light. It wasn't a death, but a metamorphosis, a liberation, from the physical form that had been necessary only while the mission was incomplete. Where the sentinel had been, a feeling of deep peace remained. Some swore they had seen a luminous form running freely among the ruins before disappearing over the horizon. The historian, despite the pain of physical separation, felt his companion more present than ever, no longer limited by form or time, but eternally connected through shared love and purpose. The following months were of profound transformation. The historian, with the support of Mrs. Elena, who had become more than an ally, worked tirelessly to document and share the complete story. A book was written, not only recounting the facts, but exploring lessons about forgiveness, the destructive nature of family secrets, and the healing power of truth. The town, which for so long had lived under the unrecognized shadow of that ancient tragedy, began to flourish in new ways. The descendants, now freed from the weight of inherited guilt, found within themselves capacities for joy and fulfillment that had previously seemed impossible. Some remained in town, working together to transform the ruins into a memorial of reconciliation. The fifth and final crucial moment in the relationship between the historian and Mrs. Elena happened on a spring morning when he found her in the library garden planting a sapling. It was a rare species, she explained, that bloomed only once every generation, its white flowers symbolizing renewal and hope. Together, they planted the tree at the exact spot where the sentinel used to lie during long afternoons of research. They worked side by side, their hands dirty with earth and their hearts light for the first time in a long time. The historian understood that his journey had been about much more than discovering the past. It had been about learning to live fully in the present, free from ghosts that weren't his to carry. Mrs. Elena, in her patient wisdom, had been not only a guide to ancient secrets, but a beacon showing the way to a shared future. The ninth, subtle, but significant turning point came through a letter that the historian received from one of the other descendants. In it, the person described how, for the first time in their life, they had been able to sleep without nightmares. Other similar letters began to arrive, each a testament to the transformative power of facing the truth. The historian's work had created waves of healing that spread far beyond what he had imagined possible. The academic community initially received the historian's work with skepticism. The mixture of rigorous historical research with elements bordering on the mystical did not easily fit into established categories. But the documentary evidence was undeniable, and slowly, other researchers began to explore similar phenomena in their own communities, discovering patterns of intergenerational trauma that had been ignored by official history. An exhibition was organized at the municipal library, displaying the documents, photographs, and objects that told the complete story. The historian insisted that Mrs. Elena be credited as co-curator, acknowledging that without her knowledge and guidance, nothing would have been possible. Opening night attracted people from all over the region, many of them discovering connections to the history they didn't know. During the exhibition, something extraordinary happened. Several visitors reported feeling a comforting presence, some even claiming to have glimpsed a silver-haired dog walking among the exhibits. The historian smiled upon hearing these reports, knowing that the sentinel, in whatever form he now existed, continued his work of guiding and protecting. The 10th and final major turning point came unexpectedly. Among the documents of the historian's family, Mrs. Elena discovered something that had gone unnoticed: a deed of ownership. The ruins and the surrounding land, through a complex series of inheritances and abandonments, legally belonged to the historian. With this came not only rights but responsibilities. The decision on what to do with the ruins generated many debates. Some wanted to demolish them, to physically erase the site of the tragedy. Others proposed a complete restoration, but it was Mrs. Elena who suggested the solution that resonated with everyone. The ruins would be preserved as they were, but transformed into a garden of memory and reconciliation, a place where history would be honored without being glorified, where pain would be recognized, but not perpetuated. The garden project united the community in unexpected ways. Descendants from both sides of the tragedy worked together, their hands united in the work of transforming a place of pain into a space of healing. Native plants were chosen for their symbolic meanings. Paths were laid out to encourage contemplation, and in the center, where the sentinel had made his transformation, a small, reflective pond was created. During the construction of the garden, the historian and Mrs. Elena became partners in every sense. The act of sacrifice that definitively consolidated their bond happened when a sudden storm threatened to destroy months of work. They both spent the whole night in the torrential rain, protecting the newly planted plants and reinforcing structures. At dawn, soaked and exhausted but victorious, they embraced among the now transformed ruins, sealing a love that had been born from shared truth and blossomed through common purpose. The inauguration of the Reconciliation Garden took place exactly 1 year after that first afternoon in the library, when the sentinel had barked his ancestral warning. The historian, now no longer a solitary archive explorer but a guardian of living memories, gave the opening speech. He spoke about how the past was not something to be buried or forgotten, but understood and integrated. He spoke of the sentinel, the guardian who had shown that love and loyalty could transcend even the barriers between life and death. Mrs. Elena, by his side, added her own words about the power of stories to both imprison and liberate. She revealed that her family had guarded not only the painful secrets, but also the recipes for healing, the songs of hope, the rituals of renewal. The complete knowledge included both the wound and the remedy, waiting for the moment when someone would be courageous enough to apply both. In the months that followed, the garden became a place of silent pilgrimage. People came not only to learn the history, but to reflect on their own family shadows. Many found the courage to investigate and heal their own untold stories. The historian's work had become a catalyst for a larger movement of truth and reconciliation. The epilogue to this story is not an end, but a beginning. The historian continued his work, now focused on helping others discover and heal their family histories. Mrs. Elena became his partner in every aspect, bringing her ancestral wisdom to complement his academic rigor. Together, they transformed the municipal library into a center for genealogical research and intergenerational healing. On certain nights, when the moon is full and the air is still, visitors to the garden still report hearing a distant bark, not of warning, but of approval. Some even claim to see paw prints that appear and disappear in the damp earth, always leading from the center of the garden towards the horizon, as if the sentinel still patrolled, ensuring that the hard-won peace is maintained. The historian often finds himself standing before the tree he planted with Mrs. Elena, now grown and strong. Its white flowers, when they bloom, seem to glow with their own light on dark nights. He thinks of his journey, how it had begun as a solitary quest for knowledge and transformed into a mission of collective healing. He thinks of the sentinel, whose love and protection had made it all possible. The true nature of the bear that had attacked him was now clear. It wasn't an external creature, but the accumulated weight of generations of unprocessed pain, of secrets that rotted at the foundations of families like poison. The attack had been the necessary confrontation with this dark inheritance. And survival? It hadn't been through strength or escape, but through the courage to look truth in the eye and choose the path of understanding and forgiveness. The garden continues to grow, nourished not only by water and sun, but by the stories of transformation that happen within its boundaries. Each plant tells a part of the larger narrative. Each path represents a journey of discovery. And at the center of it all, the pond reflects not only the sky above, but the infinite possibilities of healing when we choose to face our shadows with courage and compassion. The historian sometimes still wakes up in the middle of the night, expecting to hear the familiar bark of the sentinel, but instead of the emptiness of absence, he feels a warm presence, a reminder that true love never really leaves us. It just changes form. Mrs. Elena, lying beside him, understands these moments without the need for words. She too carries her own memories of guardians and guides who showed the way when darkness seemed impenetrable. Together, they continue the work. Each document discovered, each story revealed, each family reunited with its past in a healing way, is a testament to the transformative power of truth. The historian learned that being a true explorer doesn't just mean discovering what was hidden, but having the courage to transform that discovery into healing for oneself and for others. And so the story of the man who was attacked by a bear and survived becomes a living metaphor for all of us. How many of us carry burdens that aren't ours? How many of us live under the shadows of untold stories, of unprocessed trauma, of unfaced truths? The Sentinel shows us that there are always guides waiting to help us, if we have eyes to see and courage to follow. The town, once marked by a silenced tragedy, now breathes with new life. The cobblestone streets echo with laughter where there were once only whispers. The colonial houses, no longer prisons of secrets, shelter families who know and honor their complete stories. And on full moon nights, when the wind blows softly through the reconciliation garden, some swear they hear not just one, but a whole pack of joyful barks, as if all the sentinels throughout the centuries gathered to celebrate the victory of truth over silence, of love over fear, of healing over the perpetuation of pain. The historian, watching the golden sunset over his transformed town, holds Mrs. Elena's hand and smiles. The journey had been long and often painful, but every step had been worth it. He had begun as a man fleeing from a pain he didn't understand, and become a beacon for others to find their own way to the light. The Sentinel had fulfilled his ancestral promise, guiding not only one man but entire generations back home, back to the truth, back to the possibility of living fully without the invisible chains of the past. And you, who have followed this journey, who have felt the weight of the revealed truths and the relief of the healing achieved, at what moment will you allow your own hope to bloom in your personal desert? When will you have the courage to face the bears that inhabit the shadows of your family history? When will you allow your own inner sentinel to guide you through the darkness toward the light of truth and reconciliation?